Martha Caldwell pressed both hands flat against the side of the stagecoach and pushed herself to her feet before the driver could offer help, because she had learned a long time ago that waiting for help meant waiting forever. The advertisement she'd answered had said, "Capable woman wanted." What it hadn't said was that she'd be stepping off into a town that would look at her body before it ever looked at her face, that the man who'd placed that advertisement hadn't spoken a real sentence to another human being in 3 years, and that the ranch she was riding toward had more broken things inside it than any kitchen she could ever hope to fix. She smoothed her dress, picked up her single suitcase, and walked forward, because backward was a direction Martha Caldwell had stopped believing in a long time ago. If this is your first time here, please subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell so you never miss a story. And before we begin, drop a comment and tell me what city you're watching from. I love knowing how far these stories travel. Now let's get into it. The summer of 1884 arrived in Harlan, Montana territory, the way hardship usually did, without apology and without warning. The ground had cracked from weeks without rain. The cattle were restless. The men who worked the land wore their exhaustion like a second skin, and nobody in town had the energy left to pretend that things were fine. Martha Caldwell was 27 years old when she stepped off that stagecoach, and she had the kind of face that people glanced at for exactly 1 second before their eyes dropped to the rest of her. The wide set of her shoulders, the fullness of her arms, the solid weight of her that pressed firmly against every seam of her traveling dress. She had brown hair the color of creek mud pinned back in a practical knot, and eyes that were the particular shade of gray that looks almost blue in certain light. And she had learned by the time she was 12 years old that most people were never going to look long enough to notice the color of her eyes. She had been standing on the platform for less than 4 minutes when she heard the first voice. "Lord Almighty," a woman said, not quietly, from somewhere near the dry goods store. Nathan Cole sent all the way to Missouri for that? Martha did not turn around. She had stopped turning around years ago. Turning around only encouraged people, gave them the satisfaction of knowing they'd landed something, and Martha had decided somewhere around her 19th birthday that she was done handing out that particular satisfaction for free. She picked up her suitcase, one single case, brown leather worn pale at the corners, held shut with a belt strap because the latch had broken during the second rail transfer. And she looked down the main street of Harlan for any sign of the man who was supposed to meet her. The advertisement had been clipped from the back pages of the Missouri Farmer's Companion, wedged between notices for seed suppliers and a missing mule. She had read it so many times the paper had gone soft along the fold lines. Wanted, a capable woman to manage the ranch kitchen and household. Marriage arrangement possible if both parties are agreeable. Affection neither promised nor expected. Compensation: room, board, fair wages. Contact: Nathan Cole, Broken Creek Ranch, Harlan, Montana Territory. Her sister Ruth had stood over her shoulder while she read it the first time and said, "Martha, that man is not looking for a wife. That man is looking for hired help with a ring attached." "I know that," Martha had said. "Then why are you answering it?" She hadn't answered Ruth's question then. She answered it now, standing alone on a sun-bleached platform in a town that had already decided what it thought of her. She had answered it because the farm was gone, because her father had borrowed against land he didn't own clean, and the bank had come in February with paperwork and cold faces and taken every acre. Because Ruth had a husband and children and a house that was genuinely too small for extras. Because Martha had gone to 3 employment agencies in St. Joseph and been told at each one, with varying degrees of politeness, that they didn't have much call for women of her particular situation. One man had actually used that word, situation, like her body was a problem she'd somehow created for herself through carelessness. So she had written to Nathan Cole of Broken Creek Ranch. She had written a plain letter that said she was a capable cook, an organized housekeeper, and a hard worker, and that she understood the nature of the arrangement and had no sentimental expectations. She had not described herself, because she had learned that describing herself gave people reasons to say no before they'd even seen what her hands could do. He had written back in 8 days. The letter was short. "Come on the 15th. I'll have someone at the station." Someone turned out to be a boy of about 16, all elbows and sunburn, holding a piece of cardboard with Caldwell written on it in letters that had clearly required some effort. "Ma'am," he said, looking at her with the open uncertainty of someone who had been told to find a woman but had not been given a description. "That's me," Martha said. "Martha Caldwell." He blinked once. Then he reached for her suitcase with the automatic politeness of someone who'd been raised right, and Martha let him take it because she was tired and it was a long walk to the wagon. His name was Cody Briggs. He worked at Broken Creek as a stable hand and had been with Nathan Cole for 2 years. He told her all of this in the first 2 minutes, the way young people do when they're nervous and filling silence feels safer than leaving it empty. He told her the ranch was about 4 miles out of town. He told her the cook before her, a man named Garrett, had left in April without giving notice. He told her the hands were eating mostly salt pork and canned goods, and that some of the older men had started complaining about their joints, which probably had something to do with eating salt pork and canned goods for 3 months straight. "And Mr. Cole?" Martha asked. "What's he like?" Cody was quiet for a moment, in a way that felt deliberate. "He's a good man," he said finally. He don't say much anymore. He used to, but his wife passed, and after that he stopped himself. He's a good man, fair with wages, never raises his hand or his voice. You'll see." Martha watched the road and said nothing. She had not expected warmth. She hadn't asked for it. But something in the way that boy paused before answering about Nathan Cole settled into her chest like a stone dropping into still water. Not alarming, just present. A weight she'd be carrying. The road to Broken Creek Ranch ran through grass that had gone pale and brittle in the heat, and the mountains in the distance were the kind of blue that made you think of things that were far away, and probably better than wherever you were standing. Martha didn't let herself look at them too long. Looking at beautiful things that were too far to touch was a habit she'd been working on breaking. When they turned through the gate, wooden posts, one of them leaning at an angle that suggested it had been leaning for a while, and nobody had gotten around to straightening it. Martha took her first real look at Broken Creek Ranch. The main house was solid. 2 stories, weathered gray wood, a porch that ran the full length of the front and had a rocking chair on it that sat perfectly still in the dead air. Behind the house she could see the barn, large and well-built, and beyond that the outbuildings. Smokehouse, what looked like a root cellar, the bunkhouse where the hands slept. There were horses in the corral, a dog sleeping in the shade of a fence post, and a general quality of stillness that wasn't peaceful so much as it was tired. The hands came out of the bunkhouse when the wagon rolled in, the way men do when anything new arrives. Not crowding, but positioning themselves where they could look without looking like they were looking. Martha counted 7 of them that she could see immediately, and she knew there were more working somewhere on the property. Men who worked cattle ranches that size usually ran 25 to 30 during the busy season. She heard one of them say something low, and 2 others laughed. She stepped down from the wagon without help, and stood with her back straight and her chin level, and she looked at the men who were looking at her. And she let them look, because looking was free, and she wasn't going to charge them for it. But she was also not going to shrink herself on their account. The front door of the house opened. Nathan Cole was not what she had pictured, though she had tried not to picture anything. Hal was tall, genuinely tall. The kind of tall that meant the doorframe was a reasonable concern. With dark hair cut close, and a jaw that had probably been described as strong by every woman who'd ever seen it. He was somewhere in his mid-30s, and he wore his clothes the way working men do, like they were tools rather than decorations. And his hands when he came down the porch steps were the hands of someone who had not spent his life behind a desk. He stopped at the bottom of the steps and looked at her. Not the way the men by the bunkhouse had looked. Not that sliding, assessing, dismissive look that started at the top and finished at the bottom with a verdict already written before it reached the eyes. Nathan Cole looked at her the way a man looks when he's trying to read something important and is being careful not to miss a word. "Miss Caldwell," he said. His voice was lower than she'd expected. Quiet in a way that wasn't soft. Quiet the way a river is quiet when it's deep. "Mr. Cole," she said. There was a pause. "You had a long trip," he said. "I did." "You hungry?" "I could eat," she said. "But I'd rather see the kitchen first, if it's all the same to you." Something shifted in his expression. Not quite a smile. More like a door opening half an inch. "All right," he said. "Come on through." The kitchen was the back half of the first floor, and it was. She stood in the doorway and took it in with the calm, systematic attention of someone who had learned to assess damage before she let herself feel anything about it. A considerable project. The shelves on the west wall had partially collapsed, probably sometime in winter, and the pots and dry goods that had been on them had been moved to the floor in a heap that suggested urgency and then neglect. The wood stove was functional, but needed a thorough cleaning. She could tell from where she stood that the flue hadn't been properly cleared in months. The work table in the center was solid oak and good quality, and had accumulated a layer of use that was not filth exactly, but was the accumulation of men doing the minimum necessary to get by and nothing more. The pantry door was open, and she could see from 10 feet away that the shelves were mostly empty. Flour, some dried beans, tins of things she'd have to open to identify. She walked to the pantry and looked inside for a full minute. "What happened to the shelves?" she asked without turning around. "Bracket gave out in February," Nathan said from behind her. "We moved everything down." "Why didn't anyone put it back up?" Silence. She turned around. He was leaning in the kitchen doorway with his arms crossed, not in a defensive way, more in the way of a man who has learned to keep himself contained in spaces that feel too small for him. "Nobody got to it," he said. "I see that," Martha said. She didn't say it with judgment. She said it the way a doctor says, "I see the problem," before they decide how to fix it. "I'll need a list of what's available from the suppliers in town. I'll need the bracket repaired before I can put those shelves back properly. I'll need to know how many men I'm cooking for and whether any of them have conditions I should know about. Bad teeth, can't digest certain things, anything like that." Nathan uncrossed his arms. 31 men, he said, "including me. Hector Ruiz has been having trouble with his stomach. Doc thinks it's from all the salt pork. Old Pete Donovan is missing most of his back teeth, so nothing he has to chew too hard. That's all I know of." Martha nodded once and turned back to the pantry. "All right," she said. "I can start tonight if you can get me some basic supplies. Tomorrow, I'll give you a full list of what I need for the week." "Miss Caldwell," he said. She turned. "You don't want to clean up first? Rest?" "I'll rest when the men have eaten something that won't wreck what's left of Hector Ruiz's stomach," she said. "Right now, I want to look at what I have to work with." He looked at her for another of those careful, reading something important moments. "All right," he said again. And he pushed off the doorframe and went to send Cody back to town for supplies. She heard one of the hands. She'd learned his name was Dale Prentice, and she'd come to understand that Dale Prentice had opinions about most things, and the confidence of a man who'd never been seriously wrong yet. Say something to Nathan as he crossed the yard. She couldn't hear the words. She could hear the tone, which was the tone of a man sharing a joke he found funnier than the situation warranted. She heard Nathan's response, which was 2 words, delivered flat. The yard went quiet. She turned back to the pantry and started counting tins. By 7 o'clock that evening, she had produced a meal from what amounted to very little: dried beans soaked in the afternoon and cooked down with onion and the last of a smoke-cured ham she found hanging in the smokehouse, cornbread from the flour that was still good, coffee strong enough to stand a spoon in. It wasn't the meal she would make once she had proper supplies. It was the meal she could make tonight, which was a different thing, and still a real thing. The men came in for supper with the wariness of people who have been disappointed before and are preparing to be disappointed again. Dale Prentice sat down and looked at his bowl with the expression that said he had already decided what he thought. He picked up his spoon. He ate 1 bite. Then he ate the rest of it without looking up from the bowl. Nobody said anything about the food. Men like this didn't, as a rule. But she watched them eat. And she had always watched how people ate, had learned to read it the way some people read faces. And what she saw was men eating with attention, the way people eat when something is actually satisfying them, rather than just filling space. Old Pete Donovan, who she hadn't met yet, but identified immediately by the careful, tentative way he approached his cornbread, looked up at some point during the meal and said, "This is real food." "Yes, sir," Martha said from by the stove. "That's what it is." He nodded once and went back to his bowl with the focused appreciation of a man reuniting with something he'd missed. Nathan ate at the head of the long table without speaking. She watched him out of the corner of her eye the way she watched all of them. She had always watched. And what she saw in Nathan Cole was a man eating a meal carefully, like he was paying attention to it, like it was doing something for him he hadn't expected it to do. I didn't say anything when the meal was finished. He pushed his chair back and nodded in her direction, not at her exactly, more in the direction of the stove and the meal and whatever it represented, and walked out of the kitchen. She cleaned up alone. Cody offered to help, and she put him to work hauling water without making him feel like she'd done him a favor by letting him assist, which was its own skill. When the kitchen was clean and the fire banked, she sat down at the work table with a piece of paper she'd found in a kitchen drawer and a pencil she'd brought in her suitcase, and she started writing her supply list. She wrote it in the order of urgency. Not alphabetical, not by category. By what would do the most good the fastest. Proper flour, baking powder, lard. Salt and pepper in quantity, because whoever had been buying supplies had been buying them like the goal was survival rather than cooking. Dried fruit if they had it. Fresh vegetables if anyone in the territory was growing them in this heat. Eggs, butter, dried herbs. She'd brought some of her own, tucked into a cloth bag inside her suitcase, because she'd known enough to expect the worst and had come prepared for it. She was on the second page of the list when she heard boots on the floor behind her. She didn't jump. She'd learned not to startle easily. "It's late," Nathan said. "It is," she agreed, and kept writing. He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down, which surprised her. Not the sitting, but the lack of announcement that preceded it, the lack of asking if she minded. It was the way someone sits at their own table in their own home, which she supposed this was, for him. "The meal was good," he said. "Thank you." "Better than good," he said, like the correction mattered to him. "The men, they don't say much, but I know the difference." "I could tell they hadn't been eating right," she said. "Hector Ruiz especially. His color isn't good." Nathan's expression shifted slightly. "You can tell that from one meal?" "I can tell that from watching a man eat," she said. "He favors the softer things. He's been in pain for a while." A pause. "I should have done something about that sooner," Nathan said. "You would have gotten to it," Martha said, not in a soft way, in a matter-of-fact way. "You had other things." She didn't look at him when she said it. She kept writing her list. But she heard him go quiet in a different way than the silence of a man with nothing to say. It was the silence of a man absorbing something. "The kitchen shelves," he said after a moment. "I'll have Roy look at the bracket tomorrow. He's good with that kind of thing." "I appreciate that," she said. "The pantry list. How much are we talking?" She slid the first page across the table to him. He picked it up and looked at it. She watched his face, and what she saw was not the look of a man doing a financial calculation, though he was probably doing that too, but the look of a man reading something and finding it more organized than he'd expected, more thorough. "This is everything?" he said. "That's the first week," she said. "I'll give you the month's list once I know what the men like and what they can't manage. All right?" He set the paper down. "I'll take care of it in the morning." She nodded and pulled the page back and kept writing. He didn't leave. She kept writing. "Miss Caldwell," he said. "Martha," she said. "If we're going to be married, you might as well start there." Another pause. "Martha," he said, like he was trying the word. "Mr. Cole." "Nathan." "Nathan," she said. "The arrangement," he said. "I want to make sure you understand what I meant by it. I don't have, there won't be." He stopped and started again. "My wife passed 3 years ago. I'm not looking for another. I needed someone capable, someone who could manage this place. That's what I put in the advertisement, and I meant it plain." "I read it plain," Martha said. "I answered it knowing exactly what it said. I just want it to be clear that I'm not." "Nathan," she said. She looked up from her list for the first time since he'd sat down. "I did not come here for romance. I came here because I needed a roof and a purpose and an honest day's work. You offered all three. We don't need to make it into something it isn't." He looked at her. "All right," he said. "All right," she said. He pushed back his chair and stood. "I'll have Roy fix that bracket," he said. "Thank you." He walked to the kitchen door. Stopped. "The cornbread," he said, without turning around. "That was... My mother used to make something like that. I don't know why I'm telling you that." She looked at his back. "Good night, Nathan," she said. "Good night, Martha," he said, and he walked out. She sat alone in the kitchen with her list, and the sound of the fire settling, and the particular quiet of a house that had been empty of something for too long, and was beginning, very slowly, to remember what it felt like to have it back. She pressed her pencil to the paper and kept writing. The next morning started before the sun did. She was at the stove by 4:30, and by the time the first light was coming through the east window, she had biscuits in the oven, a pot of grits on, bacon sliced and laid in the pan, and coffee already brewed and strong. She had also, in the 20 minutes before she started cooking, reorganized the remaining dry goods into an order that made sense. Staples at eye level, occasional items lower, things that needed to be used first pulled to the front. It was not the system she would build when she had proper supplies, but it was better than what had been there, which had been no system at all. The hands came in stages, the way men do on a working ranch, where the day has tasks that don't all start at the same moment. She fed them as they came, plate after plate, and she learned their names because she asked. Straightforward, direct. "I'm Martha Cole. What do you go by?" And she paid attention to the answers, not just the names, but the way men said them, whether they looked at her or at the floor, whether they offered anything extra or just the minimum. Dale Prentice came in third and looked at the biscuits with an expression that was close to suspicious. "Those fresh?" he asked. "They came out of the oven 12 minutes ago," she said. He took two. Then, when he thought she wasn't watching, he took a third. Cody Briggs came in seventh and said, "Good morning, ma'am," with the earnest formality of a boy who had been raised to say it and said it like he meant it, which she appreciated. She put an extra biscuit on his plate without him asking. By 8 o'clock she had fed 24 men, and Nathan hadn't come down yet, and she was beginning a second batch of biscuits because the first batch had disappeared faster than she'd calculated, and she was recalibrating her estimates for just how hungry 31 ranch hands could be when they were actually eating real food for the first time in months. She heard him on the stairs, boots, solid, unhurried. And then he was in the kitchen doorway, and he was already dressed and ready for the day, hat in hand. And he looked at the table and the remnants of breakfast, and then at her. "You started early," he said. "I always start early," she said. He got his own coffee without asking where it was, which meant he'd noticed where she'd put the pot, which meant he was paying more attention than he let on. He sat at the table and drank his coffee, and she put a plate in front of him without asking if he wanted one, because obviously he did. And he looked at the biscuits and the eggs and the grits with the careful attention she'd noticed the night before, and then he ate. "Cody's going to town this morning," he said between bites. "He'll take your supply list." "I added some things this morning," she said. "Give me 2 minutes." She wrote the additions at the bottom of the second page, while the biscuits for the second batch were in the oven, and handed both pages to him, and he folded them and put them in his shirt pocket and finished his coffee and stood up. "I'll be on the south pasture most of the day," he said, "if there's anything you need." "I'll manage," she said. He put his hat on. "I know you will," he said, and he walked out. She stood in the kitchen listening to his boots cross the porch and down the steps, and she thought that there were worse ways to start an arrangement than plain words and honest expectations, and a man who refilled his own coffee without being waited on. She turned back to the stove. 3 days later, she had a full supply order, the shelf bracket repaired by Roy Hankins, who turned out to be a large, quiet man with surprising precision in his hands, and a weekly meal plan posted on the back of the pantry door in writing clear enough for anyone who needed to find it to read it. She had also begun a quiet, systematic assessment of everything else that wasn't working in the household, not just the kitchen, but the whole domestic structure of the place. The laundry was done haphazardly and infrequently. The main house had rooms that clearly hadn't been cleaned properly in months. The root cellar had a drainage problem that she could identify from the smell even without going all the way down, and she'd started asking Roy Hankins about it because he seemed to be the man who knew how to fix things and was too modest to offer without being asked. She did not announce any of this. She did not present Nathan with lists of failures or suggestions for improvement. She simply, methodically, began improving things. The men noticed before Nathan did. Meals became something they looked forward to, which had not been true before. She remembered details. Hector Ruiz's stomach was improving, so she kept his portions softer and less heavy on the salt, and after 8 days, his color was genuinely better, and he'd told Dale Prentice that he hadn't felt that good since he couldn't remember when. Pete Donovan got his bread softer and his vegetables cut smaller, and he'd told her, gravely, that she was a fine cook, which she'd heard from him was high praise. There was a man named Thomas, who was 17 and homesick and not good at hiding it, and she'd started putting a little extra honey in his coffee without saying why, which was a small thing, but small things accumulated. She could feel them trusting her. It was not loud or demonstrative. Ranch hands were not a loud or demonstrative population, as a rule. But it was there in the way they cleared their own plates and said thank you now, in the way they'd started holding the kitchen door open when she was carrying things, in the way Dale Prentice, who had laughed at something on her first day that she'd been too far away to hear, had stopped laughing and started eating with his hat in his lap. Nathan noticed on the 10th day. He came in from a long day with the herd, and the house smelled like dinner. Proper dinner. Beef stew with dumplings and apple pie that had come from a tree she'd discovered behind the old barn. A tree loaded with small tart apples that she'd stripped carefully and laid down in the cellar and the kitchen both. And he stopped just inside the back door and stood there for a moment longer than necessary. "What is that smell?" he said. "Dinner," she said. "That's not just dinner," he said. "Apple pie," she said. "There's a tree behind the old barn. I hope that was all right." He looked at her from across the kitchen with an expression she couldn't quite categorize. Something between surprised and something older. Something that had more history in it than surprise. "My wife planted that tree," he said. Martha kept her hands in the mixing bowl. "I can leave it alone," she said. "If you'd rather." He was quiet for a long time. "No," he said finally. "She planted it to be used." He walked to the wash basin and cleaned up and sat at the table. "She had the same idea you did," he said. "About the apples. Said they were the right kind for pie. Tart enough to hold up to sugar." "She had a good eye," Martha said. "Yes," Nathan said. "She did." He said nothing else for a while. She finished the biscuits and moved the stew to the back of the stove to keep it warm and checked on the pie, and the kitchen was quiet in a way that was no longer uncomfortable. "Thank you," he said, when she set his supper down in front of him. "For the tree. For asking first." "I should have asked before I picked the apples," she said. "I should have thought of that." "No," he said. "You were right to use them. It was the right thing." She sat down across from him with her own plate, because she'd made it a habit to eat after the hands had eaten, and Nathan was usually the last in, and she'd started eating her own supper at the table in the kitchen while the last of the day settled. They ate together in silence, and it was a comfortable silence, the kind that has stopped trying to be anything it isn't. On the 15th day, she went to town for the first time since she'd arrived, riding in with Cody on the weekly supply run. She needed to see what the dry goods store actually carried, wanted to talk to the man who ran it about what he could source and what he couldn't, and had a list of things she needed to see herself rather than order sight unseen. She was aware of the town looking at her. Harlan was not a large town. Everybody knew Nathan Cole's new arrangement with the woman from Missouri, and everybody had opinions about it, and small towns in 1884 were not subtle about their opinions. She was at the counter of Morrison's Dry Goods, going through her list with Frank Morrison, who was a fair man, she could tell in the first 2 minutes. The kind of man who did business with you based on whether you paid your bills and not much else, when the door opened and a woman walked in who made the air in the room change. Martha did not look up immediately. She learned a great deal from not looking up immediately. "Frank," the woman said, "I need to speak to you about my order." "Just a moment, Miss Langley," Frank said. Martha looked up then. Victoria Langley was everything the town of Harlan, Montana Territory had apparently decided a worthy woman looked like. She was slim and composed in a dark green dress that had not come from any dry goods store in any territory, with hair arranged in a way that suggested considerable time and either a skilled hand or a lady's maid. And she was the kind of beautiful that was aware of itself, that had been confirmed often enough to become a fact. She was also looking at Martha with an expression that was not quite contempt. Contempt would have required acknowledging her as something worth contesting, but was instead the particular expression of a woman who has already concluded something before she began. "You must be Nathan Cole's new arrangement," Victoria said. "I'm Mrs. Cole," Martha said. "Plain, no heat, of course." Victoria's smile moved only the front part of her face. "We've been wandering in town. However, did Nathan find you? The advertisement must have been very specific." Frank Morrison was very interested in a point on the counter. "He advertised for a capable woman," Martha said. I answered. "And here you are," Victoria said, "all the way from Missouri, to cook for ranch hands." She tilted her head slightly. "That must be satisfying for a woman of your situation." Martha picked up her pencil. "Frank," she said, "do you carry dried cherries or any dried stone fruits?" Yes, ma'am. Got a good supply in last month." "I'll take 2 pounds to start," she said. "And I'll need to know if you can get wild spices. I'm thinking about putting up preserves." "I can look into what I can get," Frank said, clearly relieved to have something to say. Victoria was still standing there. That's a very domestic aspiration," she said. "Preserves." "Yes," Martha said. She looked at Victoria for the first time fully, straight and level. "Everything worth building starts with something small. You just have to know what you're doing with it." Victoria's smile went thin. "Well," she said, "good luck to you." "Thank you," Martha said. "I don't think I'll need it, but I appreciate the thought." Victoria turned to Frank Morrison and began discussing her order in the tone of a woman dismissing a topic she'd grown bored with. And Martha turned back to her own list and kept going, item by item, in the calm and methodical way she had built everything she'd ever built. Outside, sitting on the wagon with Cody, while he loaded the supplies, she looked down the main street of Harlan and watched the people moving through it, and thought about dried cherries and apple trees, and wild spices, and the small tart apples in her cellar. "That was Victoria Langley," Cody said. "Not asking, more like verifying." "I figured," Martha said. "She and Nathan, before his wife, there was a time people thought—" He stopped himself. "Sorry, ma'am, that's not my place." "It's all right," Martha said. The wagon shifted as he finished loading the last crate, and she looked at the mountains in the distance, the ones that were too far to touch. And for the first time since she'd arrived, she let herself look at them for more than a moment. They were still too far, but the distance felt different from out here than it had from the platform on the day she arrived. She couldn't say exactly what was different. Something about the ground under her feet, maybe. Something about the fact that behind her, in the bed of that wagon, were the ingredients for meals she was already planning, preserves she was already imagining, a kitchen that was already hers in every way that mattered, except on paper. She turned away from the mountains. "Let's go home," she said. Cody clicked his tongue at the horses and the wagon turned toward Broken Creek Ranch. The supplies arrived on a Tuesday, and Martha had been awake since 4 o'clock waiting for them, not pacing, not anxious. She was not a woman who paced. She had been sitting at the kitchen table with her second cup of coffee and her notebook, writing out the week's meal plan in the precise, unhurried handwriting of someone who believed that thinking clearly on paper saved you from thinking in circles in your head. But every few minutes she looked at the back door, because she had been promised the order before noon, and it was already past 7, and she had plans that required those supplies, and she was not accustomed to waiting on other people's timing to start her own work. When the wagon rolled through the gate at 9:30, and she heard Cody calling out to Roy in the yard, she set down her coffee and walked to the door and opened it, and the first thing she did was count the crates. "That's not everything," she said. Cody climbed down from the wagon with the expression of a boy who knew bad news was coming and had spent the whole ride rehearsing how to deliver it. Morrison said the dried cherries are delayed. Something about the rail shipment from Denver. He says maybe next week, maybe the week after. Martha looked at the crates for a moment. Then she said, "All right, bring them in." She was already recalculating before the first crate crossed the threshold. The cherry preserves would have to wait, which meant she needed to think about what else she could do with the apples she'd already laid down, and whether the plum situation. She'd noticed 2 plum trees she hadn't fully assessed yet on the far side of the old barn, was worth investigating sooner than she'd planned. She did not say any of this to Cody. She just started unpacking crates. Roy Hankins came in to help without being asked, which she had come to understand was Roy's particular quality. He appeared when work needed doing and disappeared when it was finished, and he never required acknowledgement in either direction. She appreciated this about Roy enormously. "Those plum trees," she said to him, while they were stacking flour sacks. "The ones on the far side of the barn. You know the ones I mean?" "Yes, ma'am," Roy said. "Are they producing?" I thought about it in the deliberate way. He thought about everything, which was not slowness, but thoroughness. "Had a good yield last year," he said. "Nobody did anything with it. Dropped on the ground. I'd like to take a look at them today if I can." "I'll walk you out after lunch," he said. She nodded. "Thank you, Roy." He stacked 2 more flour sacks without a word, and that was that. The morning moved the way mornings on a working ranch always moved, with the sustained, overlapping urgency of people who had more things to do than hours to do them in. She had 27 men through the kitchen for the morning meal, which was up from 24 the week before, and she noticed that the 3 additions were men who had been eating at the bunkhouse on their own, rather than coming to the main kitchen, which meant word was traveling even among the men who'd been most skeptical. Dale Prentice sat down next to a man she hadn't seen before. New hire, she guessed, from the way he held himself in a space he didn't quite know yet. And before she could say anything, Dale said to the man, "You want the eggs? Take them now. She makes them right and they go fast." She filed that away. Not because it surprised her, because it confirmed what she'd been watching build for 2 weeks. And confirmation mattered. You couldn't act on things you were only guessing about. Nathan came through at 7:15 and got his coffee and sat at the table and did not speak until he'd had most of it, which she had identified as his pattern. He was not a man who was functional before coffee. He was functional before coffee, the way a locked door is functional before the key. The structure was there, but nothing was moving yet. "Roy said you're looking at the plum trees," he said. "After lunch," she said. "They're good trees," he said. "I think so too." He drank the rest of his coffee and held the cup and looked at the table in the way he had sometimes when he was working something out. "Clara put those in the same spring as the apple tree," he said. "Her idea to do a kitchen garden back there. She had plans for it." Martha turned the bread she was working on the board. She said nothing. She had learned that Nathan said what he meant to say and did not need prompting, and that prompting him only made him stop. "She didn't get to do most of it," he said. "She got the trees in the ground," Martha said. "That's something." He looked up at her. "Yes," he said. "I suppose it is." He set down his cup and stood and picked up his hat. "I'm out on the East Range today. Long day." He paused at the door. "You'll let me know what you find, with the trees." "I will," she said. He left. She worked the bread. The kitchen smelled like yeast and coffee and the particular warmth of a room that was being used the way it was built to be used. The plum trees were better than she'd hoped. Roy walked her out after the noon meal, and she stood under the first tree and looked at it for a full minute before she touched anything. It was a good tree, well-established, healthy branch structure, and the fruit was not quite ripe yet, but was far enough along that she could see what it was going to be. Small plums, dark, with the kind of deep color that meant they'd be intensely flavored rather than just sweet. "How many trees?" she asked Roy. "4," he said, "all producing." She did the math. If she did this right, if she picked them at exactly the right moment, processed them quickly, got the timing right on the sugar and the spices, She could put up enough preserves to last the ranch through winter and still have surplus. Real surplus. The kind that had uses beyond just feeding 31 men. She turned to Roy and said, "I need to talk to Nathan tonight." Roy nodded like this was a perfectly normal statement, which to him it probably was. That evening, after the supper dishes were done, and the hands had gone back to the bunkhouse and the kitchen was clean and quiet, she heard Nathan's boots on the porch and the back door opening, and she had 2 cups of coffee already poured and sitting on the table. He looked at the cups, then he sat down. "The plums," she said, sitting across from him. "I want to talk to you about what I think we can do." He wrapped both hands around his coffee cup. "All right," he said. She laid it out for him plainly. 4 trees, good yield, 2 weeks from peak, what she could produce if she had the right supplies and enough time, what that production could mean. Not just for the ranch's table, but as something that could be sold. She'd been thinking about it all afternoon, turning it over, looking for the flaws in the idea before she presented it. Because she did not believe in presenting ideas that had holes in them. "There's a harvest festival in September," she said. 3 weeks out. Morrison mentioned it when I was in town. There's a competition for preserves and canned goods. I've been thinking about entering. Nathan looked at her. "Against Victoria Langley," he said. Not a question. "I don't know who all enters," she said. "I know I have something worth putting forward." He was quiet for a moment. "Victoria's won that competition 6 years running," he said. "Her kitchen staff puts up preserves all summer specifically for it." "I know," Martha said. "I'm not saying don't," he said. "I'm saying go in knowing." "I always go in knowing," she said. He looked at her with that reading something important expression, and she met it straight, without flinching. And after a moment, something in his face settled into a kind of quiet respect that he hadn't offered her before. Not comfort, not warmth yet, just respect. "All right," he said. "What do you need?" She told him. He did not argue with a single item on the list. The next 2 weeks ran fast and hard. The plums came into peak ripeness on a Wednesday, and she spent 12 straight hours processing them, picking, washing, cooking down in batches, testing and adjusting, adding the spice blend she'd been refining in her head for days. A combination of cinnamon and a small amount of dried chili that she'd had from her own stores. Something that made the sweetness cut rather than cloy. By Thursday morning she had 22 jars sealed and cooling on the work table, and she had also, while waiting for batches to process, been experimenting with the apple varieties from the cellar in combination with the plum, and the results of that experiment were sitting in 4 additional jars at the end of the table. Roy came in at some point in the evening to see if she needed anything and stood in the doorway looking at the jars and said, in his particular low way, "That's something." "Try one," she said. She had a jar already open from a test batch. She handed him a spoon. He tasted it. He tasted it again. He put the spoon down. "Ma'am," he said, "that is something else." She turned back to the stove. Cody tried it the next morning and actually made a sound. Involuntary, surprised, and then looked embarrassed about the sound, which she found endearing. Thomas, the homesick 17-year-old, tried it and said it tasted like something his grandmother made, which she took as the highest possible compliment because grandmothers were the standard of all real cooking. Word got through the bunkhouse faster than she expected. By Saturday, half the hands had asked her. Individually, some of them casually, some of them with the concentration of people who weren't sure how to ask for something they wanted badly, whether they might have some of the preserve on their bread. She started putting it out at breakfast. The bread with the plum preserve disappeared before biscuits did, which had never happened before with any topping. Nathan came in that Saturday morning and saw the spread, and saw the men eating, and saw the empty jar in the center of the table, and sat down and looked at her. "Can I try what they're having?" he said. She handed him the bread with the preserve already on it. He ate it. He was quiet for a long moment. "Martha," he said. "Nathan," she said. "This is—" He stopped. "This is real." "I know," she said. He looked at the empty jar. "Enter the festival," he said. "I plan to," she said. "I'll drive you in myself," he said. And he said it with a certainty that was not just courtesy. It was something firmer than courtesy. Something that said he had decided this was worth standing behind. And Nathan Cole, when he decided something was worth standing behind, stood behind it. He did not know, in that moment, what that drive into town was going to cost him. Neither did she. The morning they drove to the Harlan Harvest Festival, the sky was clear and the road was dry, and Martha wore her best dress. Dark blue, well-made, nothing fancy. And she sat with the crate of jars on her lap the whole ride, because she did not trust them to the wagon bed. Nathan drove without talking much, which was his normal mode, but there was something different in the quiet this morning. A kind of accompaniment in it. "You nervous?" he asked, about a mile out from town. "No," she said. And she wasn't. She was many things, but nervous was not one of them. "Good," he said. The festival was already running when they arrived. Games and food stalls, and the kind of organized community noise that felt both celebratory and judgmental in equal measure, because small-town festivals always did. Martha recognized it immediately as a place where she would be watched, because she was always watched in places like this, and she had made her peace with being watched. What she had not made peace with, and did not intend to, was being diminished. They were making their way to the registration table for the preserve competition when Victoria Langley appeared. She was wearing cream and gold, and she had two women with her who appeared to exist primarily to confirm by their presence that Victoria was the kind of woman who traveled with an entourage. She looked at Nathan first, with the particular brightness of a woman who had not forgiven herself for letting something go and had never fully let go of it either. Then she looked at Martha. "Nathan," she said. "What a lovely surprise." "Victoria," Nathan said. He said it with his voice flat, and his body still in a way that Martha had learned meant he was working to keep his reaction from reaching his face. "And Mrs. Cole." The brightness dimmed to a more calibrated temperature. "Are you entering the competition?" "I am," Martha said. "How wonderful." Victoria's voice was the auditory equivalent of a smile that didn't reach the eyes. "And what are you entering?" "Preserves," Martha said. "Plum," Nathan said, and something in his tone made Victoria's eyes flick to him with a sharpness she didn't quite manage to conceal. "From the ranch trees." "Clara's trees," Victoria said. The air changed. Nathan said nothing for a moment. When he spoke, his voice was very quiet. "Those are Martha's trees now," he said. It was the first time she had heard him say her name that way. Her name connected to something that was hers, attached to the word now, which was a word about the present rather than the past. Victoria looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked at Martha with an expression that had stopped pretending to be pleasant. "Well," she said, "good luck to you. You'll need it." She turned away with the efficiency of a woman who has decided a conversation is over, her two companions pivoting with her in a way that suggested considerable practice. Nathan was looking at the space she'd just occupied. "Nathan," Martha said quietly. He looked at her. "Let's go register," she said. He took a breath. Then he nodded. "Right," he said. "Let's go." At the registration table, the woman running the sign-in, a cheerful, round-faced woman named Agnes Porter, looked at Martha's crate with genuine interest and said, "Oh, those are beautiful jars. What variety?" "Plum and apple," Martha said, "with spices." "How unusual," Agnes said, in a way that was entirely genuine. "I don't think we've had that combination before." She wrote Martha's name carefully in the register. "Table 3, she said. "And good luck, dear." "Thank you," Martha said. She carried the jars to table 3 and arranged them with the care she gave everything, and she stood back and looked at them for a moment and thought about plum trees and apple trees and a woman she'd never met named Clara Cole, who had planted them in the spring of some year that was gone now, and she thought about what it meant to take something someone else had put into the ground and carry it forward. The judging would not begin for another 2 hours. Nathan stayed close, not hovering. He was not a hovering man, but present, in the way of someone who has made a decision about where he stands. They walked through the festival, and people looked, the way people in small towns look when they've already decided something and want to confirm it with their eyes. She heard things, Not words mostly, but the register of things said low and meant to be heard anyway. She kept walking. At one of the food stalls, Nathan bought 2 cups of cider without asking if she wanted any, and handed her one and said nothing about it. And she took it without remarking on it. And they stood drinking cider in the way of 2 people who were becoming used to each other's company without having to negotiate each moment. Then she heard it. Not low this time. Not meant to be ambiguous. Victoria Langley's voice, carrying across 20 feet of festival air as clearly as she had no doubt intended it to. I feel sorry for her, really. He married her out of desperation, everyone knows that. She may wear a ring, but she's still just kitchen help. You can dress a cook-up and bring her to a festival, but you cannot make her into something she isn't. Martha went still. The cider cup was in her hand. She did not crush it. She was not that kind of woman. She was aware of Nathan beside her going very still in a different way. The stillness of a man whose temperature had just risen several degrees in under a second. Nathan, she said, quietly and firmly. Don't. He turned to look at her. Martha. Don't, she said again. She wants a reaction. Don't give her one. He held himself there for a moment, and she could feel the effort of it. The actual physical effort of a man exercising restraint that he did not particularly want to exercise. And she was not unmoved by that effort. Not at all. But she also knew that a scene in the middle of the Harlan Harvest Festival would follow them both a great deal longer than Victoria Langley's voice would. Around them, people who had heard were watching. Martha took a slow breath. Then she straightened her back, which was already straight, and she lifted her chin, which was already level, and she looked at the direction of Victoria Langley's voice with the calm certainty of a woman who has been underestimated her entire life and has learned that the answer to that is never to perform, but always to deliver. She can say whatever she likes, Martha said, just loud enough for Nathan to hear. She can't taste what I put on that table and decide it isn't good. Nobody can. Nathan looked at her. No, he said slowly. Nobody can. She turned back to the direction of the judging tables. I want to be nearby when they start, she said. He fell into step beside her. What she did not say, what she did not let herself feel fully yet, because this was not the moment for it, was that Victoria Langley's words had landed. Not in the place that broke her. She'd toughened that place years ago. They'd landed somewhere more specific, more current, in the particular new wound of a woman who was beginning to understand that what was happening at Broken Creek Ranch mattered to her, that the arrangement had crossed some line she hadn't been watching for, that when Nathan said, "Those are Martha's trees now," something in her chest had responded to it in a way that had nothing to do with kitchen management, and everything to do with something much harder to put in a notebook. She walked toward the judging tables with her back straight and her chin level, and she did not let herself think about that yet. The judges assembled at 2:30. 3 of them, men she didn't know, introduced by Agnes Porter with the seriousness of people undertaking a genuine civic duty. There were 12 entries on the tables in total. Victoria Langley's jars were on table 1, labeled in a careful hand, amber-colored, beautiful in the way of something produced by a kitchen staff with unlimited resources and a very clear goal. Martha's jars were on table 3, dark, jewel-colored, different. The judges made their way down the tables without hurry, tasting from small spoons, conferring in low voices, writing on their papers. Martha stood back. She did not watch the judges. She watched the faces of the people watching the judges, which was more informative. When the first judge reached table 3, he tasted the preserve and paused. He tasted it again. He said something to the second judge that Martha couldn't hear. The second judge came over and tasted, and was also quiet for a moment. The third judge. All 3 of them, conferring at table 3, in a way they had not conferred at any other table. Nathan leaned down and said very quietly, "Martha." "I see it," she said. "What does that mean?" "I don't know yet," she said. "But it means something." Agnes Porter was gathering the judges' papers with the satisfied expression of a woman who has managed a complicated event to its conclusion, and she shuffled them with the care of someone who knows what she's holding, and she walked to the small platform set up for announcements, and the crowd gathered and quieted. Martha felt Nathan's hand, For just a moment, brief and warm, before he pulled it back, settle at the small of her back. Not pressing, just there. She did not move away from it. Agnes Porter cleared her throat. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said, "our judges have made their deliberations, and I am pleased to announce the results of the 23rd Annual Harlan Harvest Festival Preserve Competition." The crowd went quiet in the specific, intent way of people about to hear something that matters. Victoria Langley was standing at the edge of the crowd with her two companions, and her expression was the composed certainty of a woman who has won this event 6 years running and sees no reason for the seventh to differ. "In third place," Agnes Porter said, "Mrs. Helen Marsh, with her strawberry rhubarb." Polite applause. "In second place," Agnes said, and paused with the particular timing of a woman who understood the value of a pause, "Miss Victoria Langley, with her apple butter." The silence that followed was not quite silence. It was the sound of an entire town recalculating. Victoria did not move. Her face did not change. But something behind her eyes shifted. Something sharp and disbelieving, and then rapidly retreating back behind the composed expression, like a hand pulled back from something hot. "And the first place ribbon in the 23rd Annual Harlan Harvest Festival Preserve Competition," Agnes Porter said, with the clear satisfaction of someone who had genuinely not expected to enjoy announcing this quite so much, "goes to Mrs. Martha Cole of Broken Creek Ranch for her wild plum and apple spice preserve." The applause started from the right side of the crowd. She'd locate it later as coming from the direction of the Broken Creek Hands, who had apparently driven themselves into town for the festival and were currently making considerably more noise than the situation technically required. And it spread outward the way real response always does. Not organized, not polite, but the kind that happens when people are genuinely surprised, and the surprise is pleasant. Dale Prentice was the loudest. She had not expected that. She filed it away. Nathan said no. She turned to look at him. He was looking at her with an expression she had not seen on him before. Not the careful reading something expression. Not the quiet river quiet. Something more open than that. Something that had let its guard down in the specific way that things let their guard down when they are hit with something they genuinely did not expect. "Nathan," she said. He shook his head once, not in negation, but in the way of someone clearing something from their vision. "You knew," he said. "I hoped," she said. "Knowing and hoping are different things." "You knew," he said again. And this time, there was something like wonder in it, which was not an emotion she'd expected to see on Nathan Cole's face, and it did something to her chest she was going to have to think about later in the quiet of the kitchen when no one was watching. Agnes Porter was waving at her from the platform with the ribbon in hand. Martha walked to this platform. She accepted the ribbon. She shook the judges' hands. She stood for a moment in front of the town that had decided what it thought of her before she'd been there a week, and she looked at the ribbon in her hands. Blue, simple, real. And she felt something she had not felt in a very long time. Not triumph. Triumph was loud and outward-facing, and she was not interested in loud. Something quieter than triumph. Something that felt like proof. On the way back to where Nathan was standing, she passed close enough to Victoria Langley to see the exact quality of her expression, which was the expression of a woman working very hard to contain something that was not gracious. Their eyes met for 1 second. Martha nodded. Once, without malice. Victoria looked away. She reached Nathan, and he took the ribbon from her hand and looked at it, and then at her, and she thought for a moment he might say something significant, something that opened a door she wasn't sure either of them was ready to go through. Instead, he said, "We should let the boys celebrate. They drove all the way in." "We should," she said. He handed the ribbon back to her. They walked toward the sound of Dale Prentice being louder than the situation technically required, and the ribbon was in her hand, and his hand was near enough that she was aware of it, and the sun was lowering over Harlan, Montana territory, and somewhere behind the old barn at Broken Creek Ranch. There were 4 plum trees that had spent a year dropping fruit on the ground for no one, and they had this year dropped it for her. She did not let herself think about what Nathan's hand at the small of her back had felt like. She thought about it anyway. The ribbon hung on a nail just inside the pantry door, where Martha could see it every morning when she went to pull the day's first supplies. She had not put it there to celebrate. She had put it there because the pantry was where she spent the first 20 minutes of every day, assessing what she had and what she needed, and she had decided that seeing the ribbon during those 20 minutes was useful. Not for pride, for calibration. It reminded her that the difference between something good and something unforgettable was usually very small. A spice combination, a timing decision, a willingness to try the thing nobody else had tried, and that the gap was always worth crossing. Nathan had seen it there on the third morning and said nothing. But he had looked at it and he looked at things that meant something to him and didn't want to be caught meaning something. She had gone on making breakfast. The week after the festival, something shifted in Harlan. It was not dramatic. It did not announce itself. Small-town shifts rarely did. But Martha felt it in the way that women who have spent their whole lives reading rooms learn to feel these things. In the slight change in how people held themselves when she came into Morrison's dry goods, in the fact that Agnes Porter had stopped in 2 days after the festival specifically to ask her about the spice combination, in the way Frank Morrison himself had said, almost as an aside, that he'd had 3 separate women ask him whether he carried that wild plum preserve, and could he get more of it. "I'm not in the preserve business," Martha had told him. "Not yet." Frank had looked at her with the level attention of a man who recognized when someone was thinking 3 steps ahead of the current conversation. "Well," he said, "if you ever were, I imagine I could move it." She had thanked him and bought her flour and gone home and thought about it for 2 days before she said anything to Nathan. When she did, she laid it out the same way she always did. Plain, organized, with the holes already identified before she presented it, because she did not believe in presenting ideas that had holes in them. "Morrison thinks he can sell preserves from the ranch," she said. They were at the kitchen table in the evening, which had become a habit neither of them had formally decided on. "Not charity fair quantities, real quantities. I've been thinking about what that would take." Nathan set down his coffee. "How many jars are we talking?" he said. "Depends on the season and the trees," she said. "This year, with what's left of the plum and the apples, I think I could put up enough for 50 to 75 jars for sale, on top of what the ranch uses. Next year, if we're deliberate about it, more." "What would you need?" "More jars. A better setup in the kitchen for processing. Roy said he could build me a proper work shelf along the east wall, somewhere to do the canning without it taking over the cooking space. Time." She paused. "Your agreement that this is worth doing?" He looked at her. "Is that in question?" he said. "I never assume," she said. "Martha," he said, and the way he said her name had a quality in it she was still learning to read. Not soft exactly, but without the flatness he used for most things. "Everything you have done on this ranch has been worth doing. Every single thing." She held his gaze for a moment. Then she looked back at her notebook. "All right," she said. "Then I'll talk to Roy about the shelf." What she did not say, what she was becoming practiced at not saying, was that his answer had done something to her that she was going to have to address eventually. Not now. Not yet. The arrangement was the arrangement, and she had come here with clear eyes, and she was going to keep them clear, and she was not going to be the woman who confused a man's respect and basic decency for something it wasn't. She told herself this firmly. She told herself this firmly several more times over the following week, which was becoming a sign of something she was choosing not to examine. Roy built the shelf on a Wednesday. It was a good shelf, solid, level, built the way Roy built everything, which was to say with quiet precision and zero ornamentation, and the implicit understanding that it would outlast everyone in the room. When he finished, he stood back and looked at it and said, "That'll hold what you need." "It will," she said. "Thank you, Roy." He picked up his tools and left, and she stood looking at the shelf for a moment, and she thought that this was what it felt like to build something. Not just cook, not just manage, actually build. Piece by piece, nail by nail, one good decision compounding the last, until the thing you were making had a shape you could stand back from and see. She had not felt that in a very long time, and she had been feeling it every day at Broken Creek Ranch, which was a fact she needed to be careful about. It was the following Tuesday when the first real trouble arrived. She was in the kitchen in the mid-morning, processing the last of the season's plums, when she heard horses in the yard at a pace and volume that didn't match any of the ranch's normal rhythms. She wiped her hands and went to the door and saw two men she didn't recognize dismounting near the porch, and Nathan coming from the direction of the barn with the contained, deliberate walk he used when he was handling something he didn't like. She stood in the doorway and watched. One of the men was in a suit. Actual suit, not town-dressed, but the kind of suit that came from a city and meant something specific about the man wearing it. The other man was younger, standing half a step back in the way of someone who is present as witness rather than participant. The man in the suit said, "Mr. Cole, I'm Mr. Alderman, from the Harlan Land and Trust Company. We've been trying to reach you." "I've gotten your letters," Nathan said. "I haven't responded to them because my answer hasn't changed." "Mr. Cole, the offer is—" "I know what the offer is," Nathan said. "The answer is no." She felt something settle in her chest, with a weight that was different from the ordinary weight of things. She did not know the specifics of what these men were here about, but she recognized the shape of this conversation. She had heard this conversation's shape before, in a different form, with different words, in a farmhouse in Missouri, when the bank men came, and her father had stood at the door saying the same no, with the same flatness, and the same truth behind it. And the bankmen had said the same things these men were saying, that the offer was fair, that refusing was not in his interest, that the situation was more complicated than he understood. The situation was never more complicated than the man understood. The situation was always exactly as complicated as the men arriving in suits needed it to be. She stepped off the porch. Nathan's eyes found her immediately. She walked to where the men were standing and stopped a few feet back. Close enough to be present, not so close as to insert herself into something that wasn't hers to insert herself into. "Not yet." "I don't believe we've met," the man in the suit said, looking at her with the particular reorienting look of someone who had not expected a variable. "Martha Cole," she said. "What is it you're wanting from my husband?" The man adjusted something in his expression. "Mrs. Cole, we represent a consortium of interests that are looking to consolidate land in the Harlan Valley area. Your husband's property, Broken Creek Ranch, sits in a location that is of considerable strategic value to our clients." "Strategic value," she repeated. "The water rights primarily," he said. "Broken Creek runs through this property in a way that gives it access that anyone buying the land downstream would need," she said. The man blinked. "Yes," he said, after a moment. "And if the ranch sold," she said, "who would control those water rights?" "Our consortium would manage." "Who would control them?" she said again. Not louder, just clearer. He did not answer that question. She looked at Nathan. Nathan was looking at her with an expression that she could not fully read in the moment, but that she would think about later. Something between recognition and something newer than recognition. "Mr. Alderman," Nathan said, "my wife said no." The man in the suit looked between them. "Mr. Cole, I would encourage you to consider." "I've considered," Nathan said. "My answer is what my wife said it was. You're welcome to water your horses before you head back. After that, I'll ask you to leave my property." There was a pause. The man in the suit folded what he was holding, put it inside his jacket, and nodded with the tight courtesy of a man who is not finished, but is choosing to present as finished. "We'll be in touch," he said. "I know you will," Nathan said. The men remounted. They rode back toward the gate at the same pace they'd arrived. Nathan watched them go without moving. Martha stood beside him and watched too. When the dust settled, he turned to look at her. "How did you know about the water rights?" he said. "I didn't," she said. But whenever someone from a land company talks about strategic value and won't name who controls the thing they want, it's usually because the answer to that question is the part they don't want you thinking about. He looked at her. "My father's land," she said simply. Different state, same shape of conversation. He was quiet for a moment. "They've been sending letters for 2 months," he said. "They started low, and they've been raising the offer every time. I haven't opened the last 3. "Don't sell," she said. "I wasn't going to." "I know," she said. I'm saying it anyway. He looked at her for a long moment, and then he said, Martha, in that particular way again, the one she was not examining, and then he stopped. Go on, she said. I'm glad you're here, he said. I don't know if I've said that. You haven't, she said. I'm saying it now. She looked at the gate where the men had ridden through. All right, she said. I'm glad I'm here too. She turned and went back to the kitchen and the plums and the shelf Roy had built, and she stood at the stove and she let herself feel, for just a moment, the full weight of what she'd just said. Not the saying of it, the truth of it. She was glad she was here. That was new. Or rather, it was not new. She had been feeling it building for weeks, had been feeling it in the rhythm of the mornings and the texture of the evenings, and the way the kitchen had become the center of something, rather than just the room where food was made. But she had not said it, even to herself, until now. She turned back to the stove. She had preserves to finish. The letters from the land company kept coming. Nathan stopped telling her about them specifically, but she could tell when one arrived by the quality of his silence at breakfast. A different kind of quiet from his normal quiet, something with more weight in it. She did not push. She had learned when to wait. On a Friday, 3 weeks after the man in the suit's visit, Cody came into the kitchen in the middle of the morning, looking like someone who had been rehearsing what he was going to say, and had lost his rehearsal on the way. Ma'am, he said, saying. He stopped. Miss Langley has been talking to people, saying that Mr. Cole is being pressured to sell, and that he would have sold already, except that... He stopped again. Except that what? She said. Except that you've got your hooks in him, Cody said, and said it fast, like pulling a bandage. Sorry, ma'am. That's what they're saying. She kept rolling. Is that all? She said. She's also been telling people that the preserve win was, that the judges knew each other, that there was some kind of... He looked genuinely pained. I don't believe it. Nobody who's tasted your preserves believes it. What do the hands think? She said. Cody blinked. Ma'am? The men, she said. What do they say? He squared his shoulders slightly. Dale told me personally that he'd fight any man in the county who said your preserves weren't the finest thing he'd put in his mouth in 10 years. Those were his exact words. Pete Donovan said that anyone talking against you doesn't know what they're talking about. Thomas said. He almost smiled. Thomas said you remind him of his grandmother, and that's the highest thing he knows how to say about a person. She felt something move through her chest that was not quite tears, and not tears. All right, she said. What are you going to do? Cody said. She put down the rolling pin. She thought for a moment. Then she said, I'm going to finish this pastry, make the noon meal, and this afternoon I'm going to go see Frank Morrison about placing an order for more jars. Cody stared at her. That's all? No, she said. But it's all for today. He left looking slightly more settled than when he'd come in, which was what she'd intended. She finished the pastry. She was putting it in the oven when Nathan came in from the yard with the quality of a man who had also been told something and was calculating how much she already knew. You heard, she said. Roy told me, he said, about what Victoria's been saying. And? He sat down at the table with his hat in his hands, which was unusual for him. He was a man who generally sat with his hat on. Martha, he said. The land company and Victoria, they're connected. She turned around. He was looking at his hat. I should have put it together sooner, he said. Her father's been investing with that consortium for 2 years. If Broken Creek sells, the water rights go to the company. The company is partly owned by Langley's money, and Victoria gets... He stopped. She gets what she's always wanted. The whole valley water supply and a reason to have driven you away without having to look like she did it herself. Martha stood very still. She's been telling people things about me, she said slowly. Because the more she makes me look like I don't belong here, the easier it is to argue that you'd be better off without me. And if you're without me... You don't fight for the ranch the same way, Nathan said. That's what she thinks. Is she right? Martha said. He looked up. No, he said. She's not right. Nathan, she is not right, he said, and his voice had the quality of something flat that was not flatness, something that had been compressed until it was almost more than it looked. This ranch is not something I'm going to trade, and you are not something I'm going to trade. Those are the same answer. The kitchen was very quiet. Martha felt the full weight of that sentence land in her, felt it settle somewhere deep and permanent, felt it do the thing it was clearly doing, and decided, for once, for the first time, not to argue with it. "All right," she said. "That's all?" he said. "For right now," she said. He almost smiled. It wasn't quite a smile. It was the closest she'd seen him get. She pulled up the chair across from him and sat down and put her hands flat on the table. "We need to think about the land company," she said. "Not just say no, actually think about it. Because men who want something and don't get it when they ask don't usually stop." He nodded. "They'll try to find another way in," she said. "Something legal, something that puts pressure from a direction you're not watching. Do you have a lawyer?" "Silas Pruitt in town," he said. "He handled Clara's—" He stopped. "He handled the estate. I haven't talked to him in a while. Talk to him tomorrow," she said. "Have him look at the water rights documentation. Make sure everything is airtight." "All right." "And the letters," she said. "Don't ignore the next one. Read it and bring it to Silas. Ignoring something doesn't make it go away." "I know that," he said, with the slight edge of a man who does know that, and had been doing it anyway, which was a different thing. "I know you know it," she said, without softening it. He looked at her. "You don't let me get away with much," he said. "No," she said. "I don't." He looked at his hat again. "Clara used to say—" He stopped. Started again. "She used to say I had a habit of choosing silence over action and calling it patience. She said one day that habit would cost me." Martha said nothing. "I don't think this is you asking me to be someone else," he said. "I think this is you asking me to be the best version of what I already am." She felt something in her chest that she had absolutely no intention of discussing at this particular moment. "Go see Silas Pruitt tomorrow," she said. "Yes, ma'am," he said. And that almost smile came back, and this time it made it a little further before he pulled it back. He left the kitchen. She sat at the table for a long moment in the quiet. Then she got up and went to check on her pastry, because the pastry didn't care about any of this and required her attention regardless. The next 3 days were quiet, in the way that precedes things that are not quiet. Nathan went to see Silas Pruitt, and came back with a face that told her the conversation had been useful and complicated in equal measure. "He says the water rights documentation is solid," Nathan told her that evening. "But there's a provision, an old clause in the original land grant, from before I acquired the property, that allows for a legal challenge to water access rights if the property falls below a certain operational threshold. Meaning if the ranch stops functioning at a certain level," she said. "Meaning if someone could argue the ranch was failing," he said, "which the land company might try to use as grounds to contest the rights, even without a sale." She absorbed this. "Then we make sure the ranch is unambiguously not failing," she said. "We're not failing," he said. "But Silas says the standard is, it's not about what's true, it's about what can be demonstrated in a legal context." "Then we demonstrate it," she said. "Production records, accounts, supply orders, everything showing the ranch is operating and thriving." She paused. "Roy can help with the operational records. I can pull together everything from the kitchen and household accounts." "Martha," he said. She looked at him. "This is a lot to ask," he said. "You didn't ask," she said. "I offered." "Still, Nathan," she said, "this is my ranch too. You told that man my answer was his answer. That means this is mine too. Let me act like it is." He held her gaze for a long moment. "All right," he said. They worked on it together for 4 straight evenings. Not romantically, not with any of the language of closeness, but in the particular intimacy of 2 people working seriously toward the same goal, which is its own kind of closeness, and in some ways, a more honest one. She pulled together every kitchen account, every supply order, every produce log since she'd arrived. He went through the ranch's operational records, pulling yield figures and cattle counts and contract records. They spread it all on the kitchen table, and they built a picture of a ranch that was not only surviving, but growing. On the fourth evening, Nathan looked at the assembled documents and said, "I didn't realize how much had changed since you came." 4 months, she said. "A lot can change in 4 months," he said. "Yes," she said. "It can." He looked at her. She was looking at the documents. "Martha," he said. Something in his voice made her look up. I was looking at her with the open expression, the one that had no guard in it, the one that had first appeared at the harvest festival when he'd looked at her holding that ribbon. And it was more open now than it had been then, and she felt the full weight of what was in it, and she did not look away. "I need to tell you something," he said. "All right," she said. "This started as an arrangement," he said. "You know that. I said it plain and I meant it plain." "You did," she said. "I need you to know that it isn't that anymore," he said. "For me. I don't know what it is for you, but I need you to know that it's changed for me, and I won't pretend otherwise, because I've already lost enough time pretending things." The kitchen was very quiet. She looked at him. She let herself look at him the way she had been stopping herself from looking at him for weeks, with the full attention she gave to things that mattered, without pulling back. "It's changed for me too," she said. He was very still. "I wasn't expecting it to," she said. "I came here for a roof and a purpose, and I made a decision not to want anything more than that, because wanting more than that had always cost me more than I had to spend." She paused. "And then you told a land company man that my answer was your answer, and I went back inside and stood at this stove, and I thought, that's what it feels like. That's what it feels like when someone stands behind you." "Martha," he said. "I'm not finished," she said. He went quiet. "I'm not going to pretend I'm not afraid of it," she said. "I'm not going to pretend it's simple, because nothing about this has been simple, and I don't expect that to change. But I'm telling you honestly that what I feel when I'm in this kitchen, what I feel when I'm on this ranch, what I feel when you look at me the way you're looking at me right now, it isn't what I came here for. It's more than that, and I think you deserve to know." He reached across the table. His hand covered hers. Neither of them moved for a long moment. Then a sound. A horse, hard and fast, coming through the gate. The kind of sound that had no business happening at that hour of the night, broke the kitchen open. Cody's voice in the yard, shouting for Nathan. Nathan's hand left hers. He was out of his chair and to the door in 2 steps. "What is it?" he called. "Fire!" Cody shouted. "South barn. Started 10 minutes ago. Roy's already out there, but we need more hands." Nathan looked back at her once, 1 second, no longer, and then he was out the door and running. Martha was already up, already moving. Fire on a working ranch was not a thing you watched from a distance. She pulled on her coat and went to wake the hands who hadn't heard. And as she crossed the yard toward the south barn, she could see the light of it. Not close enough yet to be catastrophic, but close enough to be serious. And she could hear Roy's voice, and the sound of men working, and the sound of horses that needed to be calmed. She had a thought, fast and cold and certain, that she pushed aside to deal with later. This was not an accident. The south barn did not burn to the ground. That was the first thing Martha told herself when she was finally able to stop moving long enough to breathe. The south barn did not burn to the ground, because 31 people worked together in the dark for 2 hours to make sure it didn't, and that was something. But it had come close. Roy had seen the smoke first, coming back from checking on the horses at his usual late-night round, and he had started pulling animals out before he'd called for anyone, because Roy was the kind of man who acted before he assessed and assessed while he was already moving. By the time Nathan reached the barn, they'd lost a section of the east wall and the hayloft above it, and the horses that had been stabled inside were safe in the yard, in a state of considerable distress, and 14 men were passing water in a line from the creek with a speed and organization that Martha had helped establish in the first 5 minutes by putting herself at the head of the line and not asking anyone if they minded. Dale Prentice had looked at her when she stepped in and said absolutely nothing, which from Dale Prentice was the equivalent of a standing ovation. By midnight, the fire was out. By midnight, Nathan had walked every inch of what was left of the east wall and the loft, and Martha had watched his face while he did it, not with pity, because he would not have wanted pity, but with the full attention she gave to things that required witnessing rather than fixing. He came back to where she was standing with his face carrying something that was not quite grief and not quite fury, but was made of the same basic materials as both. "Tell me what you're thinking," she said. "That this wasn't an accident," he said. "No," she said. "It wasn't." He looked at her. "You already knew," he said. "I thought it when I crossed the yard," she said. "I didn't say it because you needed to see it for yourself." He looked back at the barn. "The east wall," he said. "That's where the feed storage is. Anyone who knew this ranch would know that's the most combustible section. If the fire started there on its own, it would have started in the loft. Hay goes first." But Roy said when he arrived, the base of the east wall was already burning. Not the top, the base. "Someone set it at ground level," she said. "Someone who knew where to put it. Someone who wanted it to look like it might have been an accident but didn't care too much if it didn't," he said. She let that sit. "The land company," she said. "Or someone working for them," he said. "Or someone who stands to gain from the same outcome without being officially connected." He stopped. "I don't want to say her name right now." "You don't have to," Martha said. "We both know the geography." Howe was quiet for a long moment. Around them, the hands were moving with the quiet efficiency of people who had spent their adrenaline and were running on something steadier now. The basic determination of men who worked a piece of land and were not going to let it be taken from them without an accounting. Roy came and stood next to Nathan without saying anything, which was Roy's way of offering his presence. "East wall can be rebuilt," Roy said finally. 2 weeks if the lumber comes fast. 3 if it doesn't." "Get me the lumber list tomorrow," Nathan said. "Already got most of it in my head," Roy said. "I'll write it down in the morning." He walked away. That was Roy. The comfort of a man who immediately converts what he cannot change into what he is going to do next. Martha watched Nathan. "Go to Silas Pruitt first thing," she said. "Not just about the water rights now, about this." "I know," he said. "If this is connected to the land company, if they're escalating, Silas needs to know the full picture before they try something else." "I know," he said again. "Nathan." He looked at her. "This was meant to frighten you," she said. "Don't let it." He held her gaze. "You are something," he said quietly. "Go to bed," she said. "You need a few hours before morning." "You too," he said. "I'll be in when I've made sure everyone's settled," she said. He looked at her for another moment, that open look, no guard in it. And then he walked toward the house, and she turned to the yard and started moving through it, checking on the men who'd been on the water line, making sure the horses that had been pulled from the barn were calm and accounted for, saying the brief, practical things that people need to hear after something frightening to remind them that the ground is still solid under their feet. Thomas was sitting on a fence rail with his arms around his knees, looking at the barn with the wide eyes of someone for whom this was the most serious thing that had happened in his young life. She stopped next to him. You did good work tonight," she said. He looked at her. "We saved it," he said, like he was still verifying it. "We saved it," she said. "Get some sleep." He nodded and climbed down from the rail, and she watched him walk toward the bunkhouse, and she thought about 17 and homesick, and the particular bravery of people who are frightened and do the thing anyway. She was the last one in the yard. She stood for a moment and looked at the south barn, at what was left of the east wall, at the solid remaining 3 sides, at the evidence of what 31 people could accomplish when they moved as one. And she thought about the hand that had set that fire and what it meant about what was coming. Then she went inside and made a fresh pot of coffee, because she was not going to sleep yet, and she might as well be useful. She was on her 2nd cup, at the kitchen table with her notebook, when she heard Nathan on the stairs. He appeared in the kitchen doorway in his work clothes still, not having changed, and he looked at the coffee pot and at her and said, "I should have known." "Sit down," she said. He sat. She poured him a cup without being asked. They sat across from each other in the kitchen at 1 in the morning, and they did not perform comfort for each other. They just sat, with the coffee and the quiet and the weight of the evening between them, like something that had been put on the table and needed to be looked at clearly. "Tell me about Clara's trees," she said. He looked at her. You don't have to, she said. But I think you want to. He wrapped both hands around his cup. She came here from Ohio, he said. She was a practical woman. She wasn't a soft woman. She was funny, actually. Drier than you'd expect. He paused. She came here knowing it was hard country, and she didn't complain about the hard parts. She wanted to build something. She had all these plans. The kitchen garden. The orchard she wanted to start behind the barn. She had a list of every fruit tree she wanted and what order she was going to put them in. She got the first ones in, Martha said. She got the apple tree and the plum trees and one pear tree she was especially proud of, over on the north side. I don't know if you've found it yet. He looked at the table. She got sick in this fall of the second year. We thought it was a winter sickness. It wasn't. He stopped. She was gone by February. Martha said nothing. I didn't. After, he said. I didn't do anything with the trees. I couldn't look at them for a long time. Then when I could look at them, doing anything with them felt like, I don't know, like taking something from her, like moving on in a way she hadn't given me permission for. And then I came and picked the apples, Martha said. And then you came and picked the apples, he said, and made a pie. And the kitchen smelled like... He stopped. She would have liked you, he said. Clara. She would have looked at you and said, now here's a woman who knows what she's about. She said that about people she respected. Now there's a woman who knows what she's about. Martha felt something move through her that was too large for the kitchen, too large for 1 o'clock in the morning, too large for the precise and careful emotional management she had been practicing since she arrived at Broken Creek Ranch. She let it move through her anyway. Thank you for telling me, she said. Thank you for asking, he said. They finished their coffee. The night was very still around the house, the particular stillness that follows something loud and frightening, when the world settles back and reminds you it was always there, quiet, waiting. Go to bed, she said again. Yes, ma'am, he said, and this time he did. Silas Pruitt was a small, precise man with a considerable reputation in Harlan for being the kind of lawyer who read every word of everything and forgot nothing he'd read. Nathan came back from seeing him the next morning with a folder of papers under his arm and an expression that was focused in a way that Martha had learned to read as productive rather than worried. Silas is filing a formal complaint with the Territorial Land Office about the fire, he said, documenting the water rights claim separately, and... He opened the folder. He found something in the original land grant that the land company probably missed. There's a provision that actually protects the water rights specifically against consortium acquisition. It was put in by the original territorial government to prevent exactly the kind of consolidation the land company is attempting. Martha looked at the document he put on the table. They didn't know about that provision, she said. Silas doesn't think so, Nathan said. Or they knew and thought nobody would look hard enough to find it. They assumed you wouldn't look, she said. They assumed you'd be too. Grief warned to pay attention, he said. Yeah, I know. She looked at the paper. So legally, she said, the water rights are protected even if the ranch is sold, which means the ranch is worth significantly less to the consortium than they thought, he said. And the leverage they thought they had doesn't exist. They don't know Silas found this yet, she said. No, he said. Not yet. She thought about it. When they find out, she said, they'll be angry. Cornered people make mistakes. Silas said the same thing, Nathan said. He thinks they'll try one more approach before they back off. Something public, something that puts pressure that's hard to push back on quietly. Victoria, Martha said. Silas thinks so too, he said. She nodded slowly. All right, she said. Then we wait for it. What neither of them knew was that they wouldn't have to wait long. The Harlan Valley Cattlemen's Meeting was a quarterly event held in the back room of the Harlan Town Hall, attended by every ranching family in the valley, and serving as the primary venue for the kind of community business that required witnesses and therefore couldn't be handled in private. Nathan had been attending since before his wife died. Martha had known about the meetings, but had not attended. They were not, by convention, something wives were expected to appear at unless there was a specific reason. She had a specific reason now. Nathan had told her she didn't need to come. She had told him she was coming. He had said, "All right," in the way of a man who has learned that "all right" is the appropriate response to Martha Caldwell when she has made a decision. They drove in together on a Thursday evening, and the meeting room was already full when they arrived. Ranchers and their representatives, a few businessmen from town, the Territorial Land Office agent who attended these meetings as a matter of protocol. Agnes Porter was there, which Martha had not expected but was glad of. Frank Morrison was there. Silas Pruitt was seated in the back corner in the way of a man who had chosen his position deliberately. Victoria Langley was at the front of the room. She had not been at previous meetings, by all accounts. She was at this one, seated next to a man Martha didn't recognize, older, prosperous, with the look of someone who is accustomed to rooms organizing themselves around his presence. Victoria's father, she would find out later, though she had already assumed it from the way they positioned themselves together like the left and right flanks of the same argument. The meeting ran through its usual business: water table reports, grazing agreements, a dispute about fence lines between two ranches on the north side of the valley. And Martha sat next to Nathan and watched the room and said nothing. At a certain point, the chairman asked if there was additional business. Victoria Langley stood up. "I'd like to speak to the matter of Broken Creek Ranch," she said. The room shifted. Nathan went still beside Martha in the way he went still when he was exercising restraint, which she had learned to feel without looking at him. "The Broken Creek property," Victoria said, with the composed clarity of someone who had rehearsed this, "has been the subject of a legitimate and generous acquisition offer from a reputable consortium. Mr. Cole has declined that offer, which is his right. However, the question of whether Broken Creek Ranch is operating at a level that supports its current water rights designation is a matter of community interest, given that those water rights affect access for several downstream properties." The territorial land agent sat up slightly. "I would like to formally request," Victoria continued, "that the land office conduct a review of the operational status of Broken Creek Ranch against the threshold requirements of the original land grant to determine whether the current designation remains appropriate." The room was very quiet. Martha looked at the territorial land agent. He had a piece of paper in front of him, and he was looking at it rather than at Victoria, which meant he already knew what was in it, which meant this had been arranged before the meeting, which meant the approach had been planned, and Victoria had not simply stood up on impulse. Martha looked at Silas Pruitt in the back corner. Silas was already on his feet. "Mr. Chairman," Silas said, "before the meeting considers that request, I'd like to submit documentation that addresses the operational threshold question directly." He walked to the front of the room and placed a folder on the chairman's table. "Broken Creek Ranch's production records for the past calendar year," he said, "which document a ranch operating not merely at threshold, but significantly above it. I'd also like to note for the record that the water rights provision Miss Langley is referencing has a companion clause, Section 14 of the original land grant, which specifically prohibits consortium acquisition of water rights attached to properties with active cattle operations, regardless of ownership changes." Victoria's composure did not crack, but something around the edges of it went tight. "That provision," the territorial agent said slowly, looking at the paper Silas had handed the chairman. "I'll need to review that." "It's been reviewed," Silas said pleasantly, "by my office and by the Territorial Land Office in Helena, to whom I submitted the documentation last week. You'll find their preliminary response in the folder as well." Nathan had not moved. Martha had not moved. Victoria's father stood up. "That interpretation of Section 14 is contested," he said, in the voice of a man who was accustomed to his voice settling things. "It was contested," Silas said, "until Helena looked at it. The folder includes their response." The chairman opened the folder. The room waited. Frank Morrison, somewhere to Martha's left, cleared his throat. Martha looked at Victoria. Victoria was looking at Silas with the expression of a woman who had walked into a room expecting the furniture to be arranged the way she'd last seen it and found everything moved. She looked at Martha then, and for one long moment, their eyes held. Martha did not look away. She did not perform anything, not triumph, not challenge, not the smile of a woman who has won something. She just looked, steadily and without malice, at a woman who had spent months trying to reduce her to something dismissible, and had found, each time, that Martha Caldwell had continued to decline to be dismissed. Victoria looked away first. The chairman set down the folder. "I'll need to review this documentation fully before making any recommendation," he said. "But on its face, the Helena response seems clear. The request is noted, but I cannot move to support a review on these grounds until the documentation is contested through the proper channels." He looked at Victoria's father. "If your consortium wishes to contest the Section 14 interpretation, Mr. Langley, that's a matter for the territorial courts." Victoria's father sat down. The meeting moved to the next item on the agenda, as though nothing particular had happened, because that was how these meetings worked. But the room had a different quality to it now. The particular quality of a room in which something important has been decided, and everyone present knows it, even if nobody says so out loud. Agnes Porter found Martha's arm during the general dispersal, and squeezed it once, and said nothing. And Martha recognized this as the language of a woman who understands what public dignity costs. Outside, in the cooler air, Nathan stopped on the steps and turned to look at her. "You knew Silas was going to do that," he said. "I suggested he look into Section 14 after you told me what he'd found," she said. "And I suggested he contact Helena before the meeting, in case something like this happened." Nathan stared at her. "When did you do that?" he said. 3 days ago," she said. "When you came back from seeing him the first time, you told me what he'd found. I sent him a note the next morning." "You sent Silas Pruitt a note," Nathan said. "I told him what I thought might happen," she said. "He's a smart man. He took it from there." Nathan looked at her for a long moment. "Martha Caldwell," he said. "Cole," she said. "Martha Cole." He said it again, with the amendment, the way a man says something when it means more than the word itself. "Martha Cole." He shook his head once. "What would I be doing right now if you hadn't answered that advertisement?" "Selling the ranch to the consortium," she said. He laughed. An actual laugh, short and real, the first one she'd heard from him. And the sound of it did something specific and irreversible to her chest. "Probably," he said. Silas came down the steps behind them and shook Nathan's hand and looked at Martha with the particular respect of a man who has correctly identified where the strategic thinking came from and is not bothered by that at all. "They'll try the courts," he said. "But that process takes time and money, and Helena's preliminary position will make it difficult. They may decide it's not worth it." "And if they don't," Nathan said. "Then we go to court and we win," Silas said. "The documentation is solid, thanks to your wife." He tipped his hat to Martha and walked away. They drove home in the dark, and the road was quiet, and Nathan held the reins loosely the way he did when he wasn't thinking about them because his mind was somewhere else. "I want to say something," he said, about a mile from the ranch. "Go on," she said. "I hired you because I was desperate," he said. "I want you to know that I know that. I put an advertisement in a paper because I couldn't manage my own ranch, and I was too far gone in grief to know what I was doing. And I said all the right things about what I was offering, and none of the right things about who I was, which was a man who had stopped living and was just occupying space on land he'd inherited." She looked at the dark road. "You came," he said. "You came with one suitcase and a belt where the latch should have been, and you walked into my kitchen like you owned it, and you fixed my shelves and fed my men and fought off a land consortium and saved my ranch, and somewhere in the middle of all of that you made me—" He stopped. "You made me remember what this place is for." She said nothing. "It's for living," he said. "It's not for grief. It's not for survival. It's for building something, for making something, for coming home at the end of a day and having somewhere that means something. Clara knew that. She always knew that. And I forgot it when I lost her. And you—" He stopped again. "You brought it back." She pressed her hands together in her lap. "Nathan," she said. "I'm not finished," he said. "You told me you weren't going to pretend you weren't afraid of it. I'm not going to pretend either. I'm afraid of it too. I was afraid that caring about something again meant risking losing it again. And I'd decided that the only way to avoid that risk was to not care. which is not living, which is—" He shook his head. "Which is exactly what Victoria Langley and that land company were counting on. A man who doesn't care about his ranch doesn't fight for it. A man who doesn't care about his life doesn't have one." She looked at him. His eyes were on the road. "I care about this ranch," he said. "I care about Broken Creek. And I care about you. And I'm done treating those things like they're separate from each other." The wagon went over a rut and settled, and the sound of the horses was steady and even in the dark. "I'm not going anywhere," she said. "I know," he said. "I want you to understand what that means," she said. "It doesn't mean I'm staying because I have nowhere else to go. I have options now. Morrison said he could sell my preserves. I could build something of my own. I have choices in a way I didn't have when I stepped off that stage." She paused. "I'm staying because I want to stay. Because this is where I want to be. Because you are who I want to be next to. That's different from what I came here for. And I need you to know I know the difference." I was quiet for a moment. "I know the difference too," he said. They came through the gate. The leaning post that Roy had straightened sometime in the last month, she noticed, without saying anything about it. And Nathan brought the wagon to a stop in the yard and climbed down and came around to her side and held up his hand. She took it. She climbed down, and he did not immediately let go, and she did not pull away. They stood in the yard in the dark, her hand in his, and the house behind them was lit in the lower windows, and somewhere in the bunkhouse someone was playing a harmonica badly, and the horses in the corral were settled, and Broken Creek Ranch breathed around them with the steady respiration of a living thing that had come back from the edge of something and was still here. "Come inside," she said. "Yes, ma'am," he said. They walked in together. The next morning she woke up knowing something had settled in the foundation of her. Something that had been shifting and uncertain for months and had finally found its level. Not because anything dramatic had happened. Not because the world had changed its opinion of her, or the land company had given up, or Victoria Langley had undergone some transformation of character. None of those things had happened. But she had looked at what had been built in the past 5 months. In this kitchen, on this land, in this arrangement that had become something with a real name. And she had understood that what she had built was not temporary. She got up before 4:30. She started the fire. She made coffee. She took her notebook and her pencil and she sat at the kitchen table and she wrote a list. Not a supply list. Not a meal plan. A different kind of list. The pear tree on the north side of the property. She hadn't put it up yet, hadn't processed it, had been meaning to get there before the season ended. She needed to do that this week. She wanted to talk to Frank Morrison about a real commercial arrangement for the preserves. Not occasional jars, but a consistent supply with pricing they both agreed to in writing. She wanted to write to Ruth in Missouri. She had not written since she arrived, which she felt bad about, and she had things to tell her now that were worth the paper. She wanted to talk to Nathan about the kitchen garden. Not just fruit trees, Clara's plan, the full version. A proper kitchen garden that could supply the ranch with fresh produce and reduce what they had to buy in. It was the right time of year to start thinking about spring planting. And if they started planning now, they could have it ready. She wanted to talk to Nathan about a lot of things, she realized, looking at her list. She wanted to talk to him about all the forward-looking things that a person who is staying puts on a list. Because a person who is staying makes plans. She was still writing when she heard him on the stairs. He came into the kitchen and looked at her and looked at the coffee pot and sat down. She poured him a cup. "What are you writing?" he said. "Plans," she said. He looked at the notebook. "Can I see?" he said. She turned it and slid it across to him. He read it. She watched his face. She had learned to read it over 5 months, and she read it now. The small movement at the corner of his mouth when he got to the part about the kitchen garden. The stillness that was not a sad stillness when he got to Clara's plan, the way his hand pressed flat on the table. He looked up. "The pear tree first," he said. "I'll go with you this morning." "All right," she said. "And I want to read the letter to Ruth before you send it," he said. She raised an eyebrow. "Not to change anything," he said, with the almost smile. "Just to see how you explain all of this to your sister." She took the notebook back. "We'll see," she said. He drank his coffee. The morning began the way all mornings at Broken Creek began, with the stove and the fire and the sound of the ranch waking up around them, the horses and the men and the particular quality of light that came through the east window that she had stopped forcing herself not to notice, because she had decided she was allowed to find things beautiful that she was not at risk of losing. The men came through for breakfast, and she fed them and called them by name, and remembered what each of them needed. And Dale Prentice ate his eggs without comment, which was high praise. And Pete Donovan told her the biscuits were as good as ever, which was the highest thing he knew to say. And Thomas helped her carry the empty pots without being asked, and said, "Good morning, ma'am," with the warm ease of someone who was no longer homesick, or was less homesick than he'd been, which amounted to the same thing. After breakfast, Nathan came and stood in the kitchen doorway with his hat in his hand. "Ready?" he said. "Give me 5 minutes," she said. She wiped down the work table and checked the fire and took off her apron and hung it on the nail next to the pantry door, beside the ribbon from the Harvest Festival. And she looked at both of them for a moment. The apron she had worn every day since she arrived. The ribbon she had won by doing what she did better than anyone else in the county. And she thought that this was the picture of a life she was actually living. Not a life someone had handed her. Not a life she had settled for. A life she had built, piece by piece, nail by nail, one good decision compounding the last, until the thing she was making had a shape she could stand back from and see. She picked up her coat and walked through the kitchen door and into the morning. Nathan fell into step beside her. They walked toward the north side of the property, where Clara Cole's pear tree stood in the early light, heavy with fruit that had been waiting all season for someone to come and make something of it. Behind them, the ranch went on with its day. When word got back to town, and word always got back to town, about what had happened at the cattlemen's meeting, something shifted in Harlan that was larger than the preserve competition had shifted and quieter than it. It was Frank Morrison who told her, at the end of October, standing at his counter with the directness of a fair man reporting a fact. "People are talking about you differently," he said. "After the meeting, after Silas, after what came out about the water rights, people understand now that you were the one who saw it." "Nathan saw it," she said. "Nathan fought it," Frank said. "But people are saying you were the one who understood the shape of it before he did. And in this valley, that kind of seeing it matters. It's what keeps a ranch alive." She bought her flour and her spices, and she took his words with her, and she thought about them on the ride home. She had spent her whole life being the woman people looked at before they looked at her. The woman they assessed and categorized and dismissed before she'd opened her mouth. She had made her peace with it, had built her own kind of dignity around it, had learned not to need their opinion to function. But she found, sitting on the wagon with the flour sacks at her feet, and the mountains in her peripheral vision, that she was no longer forcing herself not to look at, that she did not want to be indifferent to it. Not anymore. She wanted to let it mean something, not because she had needed their approval to know her own worth, but because it was proof that the thing she had been building was real enough that other people could see it. A life that other people could see. That was new. She let it mean something on the ride home, and it still meant something when she walked into the kitchen and started the noon meal. And it meant something that evening when Nathan came in, and she told him what Frank Morrison had said, and Nathan looked at her with that open expression and said simply, "He's right." "I know," she said. "You're not going to argue?" he said. "Not today," she said. He sat down. "Martha," he said. "Nathan," she said. "I want to talk to you about something." "All right." He had his hat in his hands again. The nervous gesture, the one that meant what he was about to say, mattered to him more than he was comfortable with. "The ranch," he said. "Broken Creek. I've been talking to Silas about the property documentation, the deed, the water rights, all of it." He looked at his hat. "I want to add your name to the deed." She went still. "This is your ranch," he said. "It has been since the day you fixed those pantry shelves and wrote me that supply list at 1 in the morning. It's been yours in every way that matters. I want it to be yours in the way that's written down, the way that can't be contested, the way that means that if something happened to me, the ranch doesn't go to anyone who doesn't deserve it. The water rights don't go to a consortium. The trees don't go to waste again." He looked up. "I want your name on it." She looked at him. "That's not a small thing," she said. "No," he said. "It's not. You understand what you're saying." "I understand exactly what I'm saying," he said. "I'm saying this is ours. Not mine, not yours. Ours. The way this—" He gestured between them, not quite finding the word. "The way this is ours. All of it." She was quiet for a long moment. She thought about the woman who had stepped off a stagecoach in the summer with a belt where the latch should have been, and a lifetime of people looking at her body before they ever looked at her face. And she thought about what that woman had been hoping for, and what that woman had never dared to want, because wanting too much had always cost more than she had to spend. She thought about fruit trees and blue ribbons, and a hand at the small of her back, and the specific sound of a man's first real laugh. "All right," she said. Nathan released a breath she hadn't known he was holding. "All right," he said. She turned back to the stove. "Tell Silas we'll come in together," she said. "I want to be there when the papers are drawn." "I'll send him a note tomorrow," he said. "Good," she said. She stirred the pot. The kitchen smelled like something good. It always smelled like something good now, had for months, and she had stopped noticing it the way you stop noticing the particular quality of air in a place that has become yours. Outside, the ranch went on. The horses. The men. The barn that Roy was halfway through rebuilding, working with the focused pleasure of a man who has been given a legitimate reason to build something from scratch. The plum trees and the apple tree and the pear tree that had given up their fruit that season to someone who knew what to do with it. Inside, the ribbon hung on the nail by the pantry door. Inside, the list in her notebook had names on it. Things to plant, things to build, things to make, things to say. She had not crossed a single item off yet. She was just getting started. Silas Pruitt drew up the papers in the first week of November, and Martha signed her name next to Nathan's on a Tuesday morning in the small, precise office that smelled like ink and old wood. And when it was done, Silas set down his pen and looked at both of them and said, "Broken Creek Ranch, held jointly by Nathan and Martha Cole." With the gravity of a man who understood that paperwork was sometimes the last step in something that had already been true for a long time. Nathan shook Silas's hand. Martha shook it too. Outside on the street, Nathan stopped and looked at her. "How does it feel?" he said. She thought about it honestly, the way she thought about everything. "Like something I didn't know I was waiting for," she said, "until it happened." He nodded once, like that was exactly the right answer. They drove home. November moved fast, the way late autumn always does on a working ranch. The pace of things compressing toward winter, toward the putting up and the closing down, and the preparation for hard months that required everything to be in order before they arrived. Martha moved through it with the same methodical attention she had brought to every season since she arrived, but with a different quality underneath it now. Not the urgency of a woman proving herself. The steady, satisfied rhythm of a woman who knows what she is building and why. Roy finished the east wall of the south barn on a Wednesday and stood back to look at it and said, to no one in particular, "Better than it was before." Martha brought him coffee, and he accepted it without interrupting his assessment of the wall, and she stood beside him and looked at it too. The new lumber bright against the older weathered wood, solid and well-made, built to outlast the thing that had tried to destroy it. "You do good work, Roy," she said. "So do you, ma'am," he said. He drank his coffee and walked back to his tools, and that was that. The letter from the land company arrived on a Friday, addressed to Nathan and Martha Cole jointly, which meant they had already seen Silas's paperwork, which meant they were paying attention. Nathan brought it in and set it on the kitchen table and looked at it without opening it. "You want to read it first, or should I?" he said. "Together," she said. She sat down. He sat across from her and opened it. It was short, shorter than she'd expected. The consortium's legal representative, writing on behalf of the associated parties, wished to inform Mr. and Mrs. Cole that in light of recent clarifications to the territorial land grant provisions, the consortium was withdrawing its acquisition interest in Broken Creek Ranch and wished them well in their continued operations. That was all. Nathan set the letter down on the table. Martha looked at it. "That's it," he said. "That's it," she said. He leaned back in his chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment and then at her. "It's over," he said. "This part of it," she said. "Yes." He looked at her. "What's the next part?" She picked up her notebook. "Spring planting," she said. "The kitchen garden. I want to talk to you about the layout because the south side of the house gets the best light, and if we plan it right, we can put in enough to supply the ranch through summer and still have surplus for the preserves." She turned a page. "I also want to talk to Roy about expanding the root cellar. If we're going to grow the preserve production, we need more storage capacity before next season." She looked up. "And I want to write to Morrison about pricing. He's been selling the jars I sent him last month, and he wants to talk about a standing order." Nathan was looking at her with that expression. The open one, no guard. The one that had started as something rare and become something she saw every day. "You've been thinking about all of this," he said. "Since October," she said. He shook his head once, not in negation, in the way of a man who is still getting used to something wonderful. "All right," he said. "Show me the garden layout." She turned the notebook and slid it across the table, and they bent over it together in the kitchen at Broken Creek Ranch, their heads close, her pencil moving, his finger tracing the lines she'd drawn, and the fire in the stove burned steady and even, and outside the window the November light was thin and clear. Christmas came to Broken Creek with a quiet that was different from the quiet that had been there before Martha arrived. The men had decorated the bunkhouse with pine boughs, and someone had put a wreath on the barn door that Roy had definitely not made himself, but had definitely hung without being asked. Martha cooked a meal that took 2 full days of preparation, and that she would later describe to Ruth, in the letter she finally wrote in January, as the best thing she had ever made in her life, not because of any single element, but because of the 32 people who ate it, and the particular quality of noise a room makes when everyone in it is genuinely content. Dale Prentice said, at the end of the meal, looking at his empty plate with the expression of a man in the presence of something he cannot adequately describe, "Ma'am, I have eaten at tables from Missouri to the California coast, and I have never, not once, eaten a meal that made me feel like this one did." She looked at him. "Like what?" she said. He thought about it. "Like I was home," he said. She turned back to the stove before he could see her face. Thomas helped her carry the dishes without being asked, the way he always did. And he was no longer the homesick 17-year-old who had arrived the summer before, looking like he wasn't sure he'd made the right decision. He was something more settled now. Still young, still learning, but with the particular quality of a person who has found a place where they belong and can feel it in their bones. "Thank you, Thomas," she said. "Thank you, ma'am," he said, and he meant it for more than the meal, and they both knew it. Nathan found her in the kitchen at the end of the evening, after the men had gone back to the bunkhouse and the house had gone quiet. She was washing the last of the pots, not because it couldn't wait until morning, it could, but because she had never been able to go to bed with the kitchen in disorder, and she was not going to start now. He picked up a cloth and started drying. They worked in silence for a few minutes, the way people work who have learned each other's rhythms. And then he said, "First Christmas I've looked forward to in 3 years." She handed him the last pot. "Good," she said. He dried it and hung it on the rack and turned to look at her. "Martha," he said. "Nathan," she said. "I love you," he said. Plain. No preamble, no qualifying. The way he said everything that mattered to him, which was directly and without decoration, because he was not a man who believed in dressing things up to make them easier to say or easier to hear. She had known it was coming, not in a way she could have predicted exactly, but in the way you know, when something has been building honestly between 2 people for months, what its name is going to be when it finally arrives. She looked at him. "I love you too," she said, just as plain. He reached out and took her hand, and she let him, and they stood in the kitchen at Broken Creek Ranch on Christmas night, and they did not need to say anything else, because the thing that needed saying had been said, and it was true, and it was enough. Spring arrived early that year, which Roy said was unusual, but Martha said was right on time, because she had a kitchen garden to plant and she was not inclined to wait. She and Nathan laid it out together on a Saturday in late March, working from the diagram she'd drawn in November, adjusted and refined through 3 months of thinking about it in the mornings over coffee. The south side of the house got the best light. The tomatoes went there, and the beans, and the herbs she'd been waiting to have in the ground, rather than dried in bags, since she arrived. The root vegetables went on the east side where the drainage was better. She put in strawberries along the fence line, thinking of preserves, and Nathan said, watching her work the soil with her hands, with the focused pleasure of someone doing something they have wanted to do for a long time. "You've been planning this since before you arrived, haven't you?" "Since before I left Missouri," she said. He crouched down next to her and handed her a small plant she'd been reaching for. "What made you answer the advertisement?" he said. She sat back on her heels and looked at him. She had told him some version of this before. The farm lost, the agencies, the limited options. But he was asking something slightly different now, and she heard the difference. "I saw the words capable woman," she said. "Most advertisements said young woman or presentable woman or suitable woman of good character. Those were all code for something they wanted you to be before they cared what you could do. Yours said capable. That meant you cared what I could do first." She paused. "And I knew what I could do, so I answered." He was quiet for a moment. "Best decision I ever made," he said, putting that word in. "Best decision I ever made," she said, was answering it. He smiled. A full one, not the almost smile, not the quarter smile she'd learned to read in the early months. A real one. She turned back to the garden. By May, the kitchen garden was growing with the enthusiastic confidence of things that have been planted in the right soil at the right time by someone who knows what they're doing. She walked through it every morning before she started the stove, the way she had walked through the pantry in those first weeks, assessing and adjusting, noting what needed water and what was ahead of schedule and what might need to be moved before the heat came. It was a good garden. It was going to be a great one. Frank Morrison's standing order for preserves was set at 40 jars a month, starting in summer, with the option to increase if demand warranted it, which they both expected it would. She had hired Thomas's younger sister, who had arrived in Harlan in April looking for work, to help with the processing. A girl named Iris, who was 17 and quick-handed and learned everything the first time without needing it shown to her twice, which Martha considered an excellent quality in a person, and said so. And Iris had looked at her with the gratitude of someone who had not often been told that the way they were was valuable. The ranch did not look the same as it had when Martha had stepped off the stagecoach. It looked like a ranch that had decided to live. In June, a letter arrived from the Territorial Land Office confirming the final disposition of the water rights question. Broken Creek Ranch's designation was confirmed. Consortium acquisition permanently prohibited under Section 14. Documentation filed in Helena. Silas sent a note with it that said simply, "Well done." Martha put the letter in the folder with the deed and put the folder in the drawer where she kept the important things. Nathan read it over her shoulder and said, "That's done then." "That's done," she said. He put his hand on her shoulder, and she put her hand over his, and they stood at the kitchen table for a moment in the particular quiet of people who have fought something together and won, and are letting themselves know it. In August, a year and 1 month after Martha Caldwell had stepped off a stagecoach with a single suitcase and a lifetime of people looking at her body before they ever looked at her face, she stood in front of the Harvest Festival judges' table at the 24th Annual Harlan Harvest Festival with 3 entries instead of 1. Wild plum preserve, apple and pear conserve with cinnamon, a strawberry jam that Iris had helped process, and that Frank Morrison had already called the finest thing he'd tasted in 20 years of dry goods. She had not come to beat Victoria Langley. She had come because she made things worth entering, and entering them was the honest thing to do. Victoria was there, at the edge of the crowd, composed, as always. Green dress. She looked at Martha once, across the festival grounds, and Martha looked back at her, and this time what passed between them was not a contest. It was an acknowledgement. 2 women who had been on opposite sides of something that was over now. Martha did not need Victoria's acknowledgement to feel what she felt, but she received it, and she nodded, once, and she turned back to her entries. She won 2 of the 3 categories. The third went to Agnes Porter, who had entered for the first time and produced a fig preserve that was genuinely remarkable, and Martha voted for it herself in the taste she was offered, and told Agnes so. And Agnes had laughed and grabbed her hand and said, "You are the finest woman in this valley, Martha Cole, and don't let anyone tell you otherwise." "They won't," Martha said. "Not anymore." Dale Prentice was in the crowd again, louder than strictly necessary. Roy was there, quieter, but there. Thomas and Iris were there together, standing near each other with the self-conscious proximity of young people who have not yet said what they mean to say, which Martha had noticed and said nothing about because some things needed to find their own timing. Cody was there with his hat pushed back the way he wore it when he was happy. Nathan was beside her. He had been beside her all day. He was beside her on the wagon home, and he was beside her when they came through the gate with the posts Roy had straightened months ago, standing level and solid. And he was beside her when she walked into the kitchen and hung up her coat and put the ribbon on the nail beside the first ribbon. 2 blue ribbons now, side by side on the same nail. She stood looking at them. "You know what I was thinking about today?" Nathan said from behind her. "Tell me," she said. "That first night," he said. "You sat at that table at midnight writing a supply list. I came in and sat across from you, and you didn't stop writing. You just kept writing. And I thought—" He paused. "I thought, this woman is going to be all right. Whatever else happens, this woman is going to be all right." She turned around. "Were you worried I wouldn't be?" she said. "I was worried a lot of things," he said. "That you'd hate it here. That it would be too hard. That I was too far gone in grief to be worth anybody's time." He looked at her. "That I'd asked too much of a woman I didn't even know." "You asked exactly enough," she said. "Not too much, not too little." "Martha Cole," he said. "Nathan Cole," she said. He crossed the kitchen and stood in front of her, and she looked up at him, and she thought, as she sometimes let herself do now, because she was no longer in the habit of refusing herself the truth of things, that she had stepped off a stagecoach 14 months ago, with nothing but a suitcase and a skill, and the particular stubbornness of a woman who had been told her whole life that she was not enough and had simply, quietly, refused to believe it. She had not become worthy of this life because she changed herself. She had not earned love by shrinking into something easier to accept or expanding into something more impressive to display. She had walked into a broken kitchen and fixed the shelves and fed the men and looked at the fruit trees nobody else saw and made something of them. And she had done all of it exactly as she was, the full, solid, capable, clear-eyed, undecorated truth of herself. And that had been, all along, exactly enough, more than enough. The woman that every door had been closed against had become the woman that held the deed to Broken Creek Ranch. The woman that no employment agency would place had become the woman whose preserves were sold county-wide and whose name, in Harlan and beyond, meant something real. The woman that a grieving rancher had hired out of desperation had become the reason that rancher remembered what living was for. She had not won by becoming someone else. She had won by refusing, every single day, to stop being herself. Nathan put his hands on her face, gently, and she put her hands over his, and the kitchen was warm, and the ranch was breathing steady around them, and the 2 blue ribbons hung on the nail by the pantry door. Broken Creek Ranch was not the same place it had been. It was alive now. Fully, completely, undeniably alive. In the garden, and the rebuilt barn, and the ordered pantry, and the 32 people who called it home, and the preserves stacked in the root cellar, and the papers filed in Helena, and the name on the deed, and the woman who cooked every morning before the sun came up because she loved what she was building and could not wait to begin. The woman they had dismissed before she spoke, doubted before she acted, and underestimated at every turn had built something they could not dismiss, could not doubt, and could not take away. She had built it the only way anything real ever gets built, by showing up every single day and doing the work. And she was not finished. She was just getting started.